So, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time out of your schedules to attend this session. My name is Jack. I'm a librarian here with the Sunnyvale Public Library. I am very pleased to welcome you to this program to discuss how improving our transportation system with non-drivers in mind will create healthier, climate-friendly communities for everyone. To present this evening, we have a very special guest. She is an advocate for disability rights and transportation reform, as well as the author of the book, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. We have Anna Zivarts here with us tonight. Hi, Anna. Thank you so much for being here. Uh, just a tad bit more about Anna. She is a low vision parent and a non-driver. She created the hashtag without or week without driving challenge and is passionate about bringing the voices of non-drivers to the planning and policymaking tables. She also sits on the board of the League of American Bicyclists, the Pacific Northwest Transportation Consortium, and the Washington State Transportation Innovation Council. Epic, truly sensational. Before I have Anna properly introduce herself, once again, we do ask, unless prompted to participate and unmute yourself, that if you have questions during the presentation, you're welcome to place those in the chat, and I will make sure to moderate those questions across the hour. So, with that, Anna, I will let you take it from here whenever you are ready.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jack. It's great to be here with you all tonight. I was telling Jack I was juggling some scheduling stuff. I'm actually speaking at an event tomorrow in Vancouver, BC, and so came up tonight and was hoping to make it through the border and get settled in the hotel before this event tonight with you all, and we made it. So I'm excited about that. So great to be here. Um, yeah, also really happy to connect with folks in Sunnyvale. I went to school in the Bay Area. It was sort of the first place I'd lived with transit, and so have very fond memories of Caltrain. So, um, and also at that point in my life, I was out a lot in San Francisco, going out late and getting stuck at the Millbrae station after Caltrain had stopped running. Was sort of my other formative experience a couple of nights. So I'm going to share some slides. This is going to be a fairly interactive presentation. If you are willing to be interactive, I understand sometimes you just want to sort of unwind and listen, and that's fine too. But I love getting to hear from people from around the country and around North America about their experiences with transportation access. And so throughout this, I will be asking you all questions. You are welcome to share by raising your hand. I'll call on you. You can come off mute. Or if you'd prefer, you can put those your responses in the chat, and I will check in with Jack on a regular basis and have him read those out loud. So also, just as a practice of accessibility, I'm going to do something today that may be a new practice for some of you. As I'm presenting, I'm going to try to verbally describe any visuals and read any text that's on the screen of my slides. And they're not very text heavy, but this is just something that I find really helpful when I'm in presentations, especially at conferences when I can't see the slides, or sometimes when I'm multitasking and listening to a presentation and not wanting to look at my screen. And so this is a sort of one of the practices of accessibility that I like to play around with. So this first slide says harnessing the expertise of non-drivers. It's got my name on it, Anna Zivarts, my contact information, Anna at nondrivers.org, and nondrivers.org is the organization that I'm working with right now. And the image on the screen is some non-drivers from Washington State, Kat and JR. Kat's in a power wheelchair. JR has a service dog. They're both low vision and blind, and Kat's using a power chair. And in this case, she's parked out in the middle of the street because the bus stop that they're waiting at is loose gravel. And if her power chair went into that loose gravel, she would get stuck. And in the back behind them is actually my bike that's laying on its side. I had biked to the ferry to take the ferry across to meet them in the community that they live in Washington State. So we're going to be talking more about the experiences of non-drivers today, and also hearing about your experiences of being of transportation access and what brought you sort of here to this conversation tonight. So this next slide is a picture of Washington State. This is the road that I grew up on. It looks pretty similar to that road that JR and Kat were waiting on. Jack was telling me earlier that he actually spent some time in Washington State. This probably looks kind of similar to the area that he was into. It's a rural road, lots of tall, dark trees, no shoulders, no sidewalks, no transit access. And this is the reality for the built infrastructure in a lot of our country. And growing up here as someone who was born with a visual impairment, I really struggled because everyone around me who had sort of the freedom to go places could drive, and that's how they got there. And I didn't really, wasn't able to think about how was it that people could get around without driving? What were the possibilities? It wasn't sort of a reality to me until I left, went to school in the Bay Area, and spent a lot of time up, going up to San Francisco, hanging out, taking the buses and BART and Caltrans up there. And then I also then moved to New York City after college, mostly because of the having the transportation access that New York City had, having the subway frequencies, having such a large population of other people who couldn't drive. That felt really important to me. As a young person, I was very I had a lot of shame around my disability and didn't want people to know that I was visually impaired. And so it was easier for me to be in a place like New York City where I didn't have to, tell employers when I interviewed with them that I couldn't drive, right? Or tell people, the first time we were planning to hang out that I needed, to figure out how to get there because I couldn't drive there. In New York, it was just assumed that you would take the subway. You looked up, directions to the doctor's office, and it was always which subway stops were closest. Never, where the parking garages were, or, the nearest exit off the highway, which is the case in Seattle. And then in 2016, I became a parent. I had a kid, and we decided to move back to Washington State, to be closer to family and to have that support. And it was at that time when I came back to Washington State and I started working for Disability Rights Washington, which is a disability rights organization here. And I met a lot of my coworkers who couldn't drive either, and that was really exciting for me because previously my experience was that everyone in Washington State could drive, and suddenly I was like, wait, there's actually so many non-drivers who are disabled, who are living full and interesting and complete lives in community, who can't drive, and it's possible for us to do this even in places that aren't New York City, that aren't San Francisco, places that have less transportation access. So this next slide is where we get to get a little interactive, and I might come off of full screen so I can see your faces for a second. But the question is, who do you know who can't drive or doesn't have reliable access to a car? And there's some images here to sort of prompt your mind about what that could, who those people could be. I'll describe them for you just to sort of get you started, and then you can think about if you want to raise your hands or put comments in the chat. Go for it as I'm talking. But yeah, the pictures on the far left are my two grandmas. My grandpas both passed away before I was born, but my two grandmas were both non-drivers in the latter parts of their lives. My grandma on the upper left lived for about 30 years with low vision and couldn't drive because of that. And she actually moved from Long Island to Waikiki to Hawaii because she could get around there without driving. It was easy for her to walk places, to take the bus places. And that's an image of me as a little girl visiting her. The image on the bottom left is my other grandma who lived in rural southern Indiana on a farm and developed a heart condition where she couldn't drive, or wasn't supposed to drive because she would lose consciousness. But nobody could take her keys away. And she kept on driving. She would periodically drive off the road when she lost consciousness. But it was so rural that she was able to not hurt anyone and did not stop driving before she passed away. Then there's some images on the far right is sort of the other end of the age spectrum. On the bottom right is my kid and another kid waiting for the bus in Seattle. Young people are non-drivers. And then above that, we have a group of youth in Seattle who are waiting for the bus. Increasingly, people who are old enough to drive are choosing not to for a whole host of reasons. Some of it's affordability, some of it's the stress of driving, some of it's having other options like ride hail, right? So there's been a big decrease in the percentage of young people, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, people even in their 20s too, not getting their driver's licenses right away, not owning cars. And then, there's some other people here pictured, people who are more, can't afford to drive, right? Because the cost of driving is so expensive. We see a lot of folks who rely on transit, especially immigrant communities, communities of color, low income communities. And this picture in the middle on the top represents it's folks riding the bus in my neighborhood in Seattle during the pandemic when a lot of people with choices were choosing not to ride transit because of the, fear of COVID. But there were a lot of people who didn't have that option and were still riding the bus because it was how they got around. And then on the bottom in the middle is Erica, and Erica's picture sort of represents the last big group of non-drivers, and that's folks with disabilities who can't drive for a variety of access reasons. Maybe that's vision, maybe that's mobility disabilities, mental health reasons, anxiety, PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, epilepsy. Neuromuscular diseases, right? There's lots of reasons and lots of ways that that driving becomes or can be not safe or possible. So I'm gonna come off a full screen so for a moment so I can see you all. Um, would love to hear, yeah, if anyone wants to share, you can raise your hand or put in the chat. Who do you know who's a non-driver? Who doesn't have access to a car? Maybe they choose to, maybe they don't have that choice. Who do you know in your life who can't drive or can't afford to drive?
I know first to kick it off, perhaps.
Thanks,
Um,
Jack.
I know that I live in San Francisco myself, so I take the Caltrain down every day to Sunnyvale. But everyone I know, all the, friends and kind of acquaintances that I've met in San Francisco, no one has a car. It's very
Mm,
public transportation focused. But they're also, younger adults who may not, who definitely cannot afford a car. So Muni and Bart are their best friends. So I know a lot of people my age, mid 20s, early 30s, who also living in a metro area just like never felt the need to get a driver's license. So I've also found that as well. So my partner and I are one of the few people who do have a car. We moved here last year and we moved across the country. So we
mm,
drove all the way across the country. So that's the only reason we have a car. Other than that, we rarely use it. So,
yeah.
um, big public transport people. Love Muni, love Caltrain, when it's on time. Um, so yeah,
Well, yeah, no, and thanks for, talking a bit more about that, the sort of the group of folks who, yeah, live in cities and can set up their lives, right, in ways that work well for not driving, right? And there's a lot
mm,
of folks like that. Like, and I sort of, in the book I call them choice non-drivers. I think choice is kind of it's not always a total choice. Like car ownership can be so expensive, right? But people who have figured out how to live great lives without driving, even if they could drive, are definitely part of the non-driving community. Jack, do you want to read a few of the other responses from the chat?
absolutely. We have Bryce saying their household in Sunnyvale is car free, but that's out of choice rather than necessity. So perhaps feels
Mhm.
like they can get around with that one. Uh, Kathy says a couple of friends are unable to drive, elderly aunts and an uncle. Um, Maria says she has a friend who's legally blind. And Augie says they're unable to drive now for medical reasons. So quite a few different reasons in the chat.
Yeah, cool. Well, thank you all for sharing. Really appreciate that. So, this is the statistic, and why I like to start with sort of those personal connections and stories is that I feel like when I start with this number, there's a lot of disbelief. I was just texting or had a Blue Sky thread with Alyssa Walker, who's a journalist down in LA, has a blog called Torched that's covering the Olympics in LA, and she had a similar response when she was sharing this number as well, but really, a third of the population in the US are non-drivers. If you take together everyone who can't afford to drive, who is too young to drive, has aged out of driving, chooses not to drive, and can't drive because of disabilities, it's around 30% of the population. 36.6% of the population actually over the age of 10, and so that's cutting out the youngest people. The NRDC just released a study, and they found that that 36.6 of the population over the age of 10 in the U.S. Don't have reliable access to a car. So big number. The other thing I think it's important to recognize here is that there's this sort of, notion that for many disabled people, driving is how we need to get around or do get around. And I think a lot of that comes from sort of this, the visibility of the disabled parking spot, which is great. We need more, more dedicated parking for people with disabilities. But it sort of links cars and disabled people in people's minds in this way that I think erases the fact that for most disabled people, either because of our disabilities or because so many disabled people are low income, driving is not an option for us. And this statistic is also from NRDC. 73% of people with disabilities don't drive for most of their trips. I think that's important to notice and recognize. So yeah, there's a lot of non-drivers. There's a lot more of us that I think we talk about than we plan for, than we budget for in many of our communities and our transportation spending. And then that we think about when we're, thinking about our land use, where we're building housing, where we're siting hospitals and schools. We're just sort of the mobility needs of people who aren't able to drive or choose not to drive or can't afford to drive are largely discounted. And so part of my vision and hope for this book and for the, giving these presentations is that we start to sort of nudge that a little bit and be a bit more visible. And I think, one really good way of being visible, and this picture illustrates that well, is riding the bus, riding transit. And that's where you really do see the people who are using transit, right? Many of whom are there because they don't have other options, or this is the best option for them. And it's a really sort of manifest way to see and feel that non-driver community. This image here is it's the bus. It's called the bus, the system in Oahu in Hawaii, which has really high ridership compared to a lot of other parts of the U.S. And also really high coverage of the island. So I want to get into a little bit sort of how non-drivers get around and you all probably know this a bit from your own experiences or the experiences of people you know and connect with, but first of all, I think this slide is important to talk about because there's also this assumption that oh, non-drivers are people who are riding the bus or riding light rail or the train or the subway or biking, where the reality is in most of the US, those options don't exist or aren't feasible. And so most non-drivers are actually getting rides from other people. We found this from a study that was done in Washington State. It was a statewide study representative of our state population that looked at sort of the overall population of non-drivers, but then also how we got around. And then how we felt about those choices. And what that study found was that most non-drivers are actually asking for rides from other people, but that didn't feel like a good or viable choice in most situations. It felt like it came with sort of a high emotional cost because it was always, the need to ask for favors. There's a quote here from Jaime Torres, who's a non-driver, who now lives in California, actually. And he says, it is beyond frustrating having to depend on others for transportation. It really does affect me to the point where it's easier to just isolate myself in my room so I don't feel like a burden. Um, and so, while yes, many non-drivers do have sort of social networks, friends and family that they can ask on, call on for rides when they need to, that doesn't, that does have a price. And so if given the option to not have to do that, many of us would prefer not to. Many of us would prefer other ways of getting our transportation needs met. One of those ways is paying for rides, but again, recognizing that there's a lot of poverty among non-drivers, especially in the disability community, but also just so many non-drivers who can't afford paying for rides, and the cost. At least in Seattle now, the cost of ride hail is pretty excessive. You're not really going anywhere for less than $50, and so that becomes, a trade-off, right? Maybe it's something you could do in an emergency, but for most folks who need to get places, who can't drive, that's not an affordable option. This is an image of Amandeep, who's a non-driver from Washington State, who shared with me, about the poverty in the blind community and, how frustrating that is when ride hail has, gotten a lot more expensive, has started to reflect the more real cost of what it costs to drive someone somewhere. And that has made it, priced it out of reach for many people in the blind community. There's also, for wheelchair users, especially if you're in a heavier power wheelchair that doesn't, fold up into a trunk, your options are quite limited, right? So if you want to share in the chat, go for it. I'm gonna go through a couple slides that have some questions for thought on them, and then I'll pause and see if Jack um, wants to read any responses out loud. But thinking about who do you know, like how does ride hail work in your community? How does wheelchair accessible ride hail work? Are there wheelchair accessible options? Are there wheelchair accessible taxis? Um, and I always get questions about sort of robo taxis and the future of autonomous vehicles. And my response to that is often, like it's not, I don't see it being uh, changing the equation around mobility access for many non-drivers because ride hail hasn't, right? Ride hail is still out of reach or not accessible for so many people. So where does that leave us? That leaves us with transit. Transit in the big sense, talking about transit, paratransit, on-demand rides for people who need that. Transit is freedom. There's an image here of Abby Griffith, who's a transit rider who grew up in a rural area like I did, and then was able to move into a city on a bus line. And she says, of that move, the room I rented was right next to the bus number 30. It was life-changing for me to know that I have access to places. She, growing up as a high school student, lived with a single mom who couldn't, didn't have time to drive her where she needed to go, where she wanted to go. And so she describes, like, Jaime described, a lot of depression and anxiety and stress around, feeling stuck at home. And then that freedom and that joy of living near that bus and having the ability to go to the grocery store when she wanted to go to the grocery store. But with that transit comes how do you get to that transit? And I think this is what Michael was pointing out earlier, right? That it's not just about having that transit route that it goes where you need to go and runs frequently and reliably. You also need a path to get there, a distance that's reasonable, a sidewalk that's accessible, crossings that are safe. And the person who really helped me understand this the most was Crystal Monteros, who's a wheelchair user, pictured here on the left. This is her talking to some elected officials about her frustration with a missing sidewalk that to connect her bus stop to the apartment complex where she lives. And she says, we need to start thinking about public transportation and sidewalks as going together instead of as two separate things. You can't use the bus if you can't get yourself to the bus stop. So I am internally grateful for Crystal for really like helping me understand how how profound that is, especially for people with mobility disabilities. Those missing connections are, the difference between being able to use a fixed route bus and having to, call a day ahead for paratransit to get picked up right from their door, and that lack of flexibility and sort of scheduling flexibility that comes from with paratransit can be really frustrating when people would just like to be able to get down the block, down the street to their bus stop safely. Accessing that stop, also is often about crossings and having a safe and comfortable place to cross. There's an image here of a crossing in Seattle, Washington that I've been part of a group of folks advocating to improve for a long time. This one is we're building a light rail station in the middle of a highway interchange, one of those clover leafs. And so to get to that light rail station, pedestrians will need to cross these unsignalized on and off ramps where you just kind of have to wait and dodge on oncoming traffic. And there's an image here on the right of Micah, who's a blind transit user who was trying to cross in one of these places, and he went over to the sign, which he thought was a pedestrian, an accessible pedestrian signal button, to get an audible signal, but it's really just a sign that says with a picture of a bike and a person walking, and it says use caution while crossing. So Micah responded to that. So they can't see us and I can't see them. That's tough to this, situation where he is trying to cross at this curve where cars are coming off the highway at highway speeds. So, for these transit networks to truly work for us, we need crossings that prioritize access over speed, that make us possible for us to get, to that nearest bus stop, to that nearest transit stop, and back, on the return trip. Also part of this conversation too, right, is the distances we need to travel, right? Because if the places you need to go are really far apart, that distance can be more easily traveled in a car, maybe in a bus, but definitely, walking or rolling or biking no longer are feasible options. And so thinking about the land use part of this conversation is really key, that it's not enough to just talk about, buses and sidewalks. We need to talk about, where are there grocery stores? Where are there not grocery stores? Where are there pharmacies? What neighborhoods in our larger metro areas have those resources and which don't? When we talk about more rural communities, where do those services exist, and where do they not? This image on the top right, is an image of, this is the town of my grandma in Southern Indiana lived in. Was a fully functioning community with all the, the pharmacy, the grocery store, the school, the hardware store. This was the hardware store. All those existed in the 50s and 60s. Then a highway got built adjacent to the community, and it became much cheaper for residents to drive into town, the next nearest town, which was around 20 miles away, for all those needs. The population in this community has not decreased, but there aren't stores there anymore. And so by the time my grandma wasn't able to drive, she had to drive those 20 miles into town unless she was going to move into a nursing home, because there were no nearby options. And so, thinking about this, access to the things we need is that is also part of the transportation solution. And a big part of that is housing. Obviously, you're in California, you are probably involved with conversations there around affordable housing. There's a quote here from Vaughn Brown, who is someone from Washington State who was priced out of a community, sort of a bedroom community from outside of Portland, Washington, or Portland, Oregon, because of the cost of housing. And he says, more affordability means moving further out means more limited transportation. And that was a really painful trade-off for him as someone who was deaf, blind, and couldn't drive, right? And to have to go further and further. And he described, walking down these, a mile on these rutted sidewalks to try to get to the Fred Meyer to go shopping, in this community where he could afford to live. And so the housing part of this land use piece is so critical and can't be ignored. The picture on the bottom is this is my neighborhood in Seattle. There's light rail nearby. There's also been a lot of development, and that's exciting. But unfortunately, it's still extremely expensive. These are townhomes that are getting built, and they're, minimum starting at $800,000. And for many families, that's just not feasible. The people that I work with, who are non-drivers throughout our state, they would dream of living close to the light rail with light rail access, but for most of them, that's just not gonna, at that price point, it's not possible. And so they're far, far, far out, in exurbs and suburbs, even back with family in rural communities, because of the high cost of housing. So that's something we need to address. All right, I'm gonna pause for a second, and see, let's see, Jack, anything from the chat?
Yes, a couple comments from your previous slides. Bryce made a couple points saying things that are going on in Sunnyvale. There's a project going on in the city to exchange parking on Hollenbeck Avenue for full-time protected bike lanes, coming up in the city council meeting on December 2nd. The biggest pushback, he notes, to this project is the adjacent homeowners afraid that they'll lose their parking spots. They often cite concerns around accessibility concerns for the disabled, but this also unfortunately misses all the accessibility concerns for those that cannot drive. So that was a point made. And then he also added Cupertino and Santa Clara, surrounding cities to Sunnyvale, have subsidized ride-hail programs through or via Silicon Valley Hopper that provides door-to-door transportation for a flat cost of $2.50. Sunnyvale has been ostensibly considering joining this program and has something similar similar called Peary Park rides for a smaller section of the city. So apparently not the entire city.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then we have a comment from Augie, specifically Augie's mother. Um, she's lucky enough to be stay-at-home mom, so I don't need to drive that much. But when we need to do major grocery shopping, my husband has to do the driving. Although there is one within walking distance. My oldest son is old enough to drive, fortunately, but she's scared of biking. So that is another
Mm-hmm.
interesting point. And then one more comment from Bryce. Something that really surprised him about visiting the Netherlands, specifically Amsterdam, was that the further from the city center you got, the better the bike and pedestrian infrastructure became. Bidirectional, separated bike paths, and walking trails almost everywhere. Fewer at-grade crossings with major roadways, etc. These didn't fit in the city center, but the urban planners didn't skimp when they had the space for them.
Ooh, interesting. Yeah, wow, cool. Well, thanks everyone for sharing. Those are some super interesting thoughts. Yeah, I went to the Netherlands actually when I was writing the proposal for my book. I had been part of this very painful work group with the city of Seattle, and I told myself if I made it through the full year of very painful meetings, I would take the stipend and take myself to the Netherlands for the first time. And so, yeah, I unfortunately showed up with a raging ear infection, and so I was really sick for a good part of it. But yeah, the infrastructure there was interesting, and I one thing I was super impressed by was the, at in the rural communities, you would be sort of in these outskirts areas, and the bus stops would have so many bikes parked at them. Like people were
Mm.
biking to these bus stops to then, get on the bus and go into town. So very cool. Um, so I'm going to get into solutions a little bit now, and then we'll take some more questions. And I actually have a video to play too, a short video. So the solutions that I'm most excited about really sort of center around changing who gets to sit at the table. And I say this because, I think every community is different. Needs are different, right? And the people who know what needs to be done in their communities are the people who are out there day in and day out using transit, walking and rolling, waiting at transit stops in the rain, in the sun, in the cold, right? And know, what's not working about the system and are super motivated to change it. I cannot emphasize enough the passion around transportation that comes from people who can't drive because we spend so much of our time thinking about how the system's not working and how to make it better. And so I really, uh, urge, especially people sort of working in that transportation space who aren't necessarily thinking about um, hiring non-drivers and in particular, disabled or low income non-drivers. What would it take to get those voices at the table? Because they, will make a difference and make our communities more accessible. This image on the right is a walk audit that I was part of that was organized by our state Department of Transportation, where they hired me to contract with some folks in the disability community to come out and walk with a bunch of urban planners and engineers around some infrastructure that they had designed and give feedback. And so this was, one way to sort of bring those voices in. But I also think it's so valuable if we got more people with those experiences of relying on transit with different kinds of disabilities in the room, actually, working for these agencies. Um, so yeah, some of my bullet points here. First is hire disabled and non-driving staff. Thinking about, job requirements. What sort of requirements are you listing that could not only turn people, exclude people, but also discourage people? Sure, if you're a person with a disability, you can ask for accommodations on a job. But if that job posting, clearly says, you need a driver's license and the ability to lift 40 pounds, and it's for a planning job, it just sounds like the kind of place that's not going to be particularly thoughtful or accommodating, for people who aren't sort of that standard prototypical worker of past, eras that needed to lift 40 pounds every day. So, and then the next point is creating opportunities to learn from disabled experts. That's really walk roll audits, walkabouts. These are good opportunities. Also, creating coalitions, right, with people outside of it. If you're someone who, is part of a bike advocacy group, for example, or a transit advocacy group, what does it mean to partner with youth who are non-drivers, with disabled folks who are non-drivers, with immigrant communities, especially communities that are helping support refugees and other folks who are recently arrived in the U.S. What does it mean to partner with those groups? And then finally, adding non-drivers to decision-making bodies, and I'm going to go into that a little bit deeper in a minute. An easy sort of starting point for all of these processes is the Week Without Driving, which is an event, a challenge, that we created back in 2021 in Washington State, and it's now grown to a national and even somewhat international challenge. We just wrapped up our 5th year and had participants from all 50 states. We had over 1,000 elected leaders, more than 600 co-hosting organizations. You can see more at weekwithoutdriving.org. I was actually working on the website a little bit this morning. We need an update. So it's the information's all current there, but it needs to be a little snazzier. So that's on my agenda for the next month. But yeah, these other images are some examples from Week Without Driving that I thought have been cool over the years. This one on the left is a council member from Washington State who shared about her experience riding the bus. And she used her, her digital marker or whatever to mark up how dark it was at these bus stops, which I just loved. Her, noticing and advocating for change, right? And on the right is a transit agency in Toledo, Ohio, that did a whole bus route for Week Without Driving, which I thought was pretty cool. So, um, I'm gonna play a quick video, and I think this will give you a bit more sense of a Week Without Driving. And then I'll ask too, if anyone has experienced Week Without Driving, feel free to share in the chat. Or if you were to think about what if you are someone who now drives, who currently drives, what would your experience be like if you were to try to experience Week Without Driving? So hang on while I play this.
Next week marks day one of a week-long effort to get people who can drive or afford a car to experience what life is like without personal transportation.
Central Oregon Community College is taking part in the National Week Without Driving.
Advocates in the Coulee region are looking to spread awareness about the difficulties of people who can't own or drive a vehicle.
Many of us have cars and enjoy the privilege of driving to where we need to go when we want to. But according to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, 40% of residents in the city of La Crosse don't drive. Now, this can make life less accessible for non-drivers. In order to fully understand what life would be like without a car and how our public transportation system can improve, there is a challenge to try not driving.
The group is inviting the public to participate in its Week Without Driving campaign. According to Living Streets Lexington, 1/3 of the city's residents are unable to drive.
Getting to work, buying groceries, making a doctor's appointment without a car, it's a daily reality for them. And in a society like ours built around vehicles, it can present some serious challenges.
Mesa County Regional Transportation Office urges you to consider what it'd be like to try to get to an appointment or go to work without your own car.
Grand Valley Transit is inviting community members to join them in a Week Without Driving, an event that lets the community consider the everyday reality of those who don't drive.
It starts Monday, and we'll let Austinites who have cars experience the city through the lens of non-drivers.
Next week really is an eye-opening opportunity to see our city and our transportation system in a different way and to build empathy for the thousands of Austinites who don't drive.
The Idaho Walk Bike Alliance is challenging people in Pocatello to ditch their cars this week.
A Week Without Driving campaign focuses on advocating for more accessible and inclusive transportation options.
This week kind of gives you a glimpse in how many things you can do without actually getting in your vehicle. Give it a shot and see what it's like to go 1 week without driving.
The North Coast is taking part in the annual Week Without Driving. This initiative challenges residents, especially local leaders and decision makers, to step into the shoes of community members who can't drive.
The Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities, along with several partner organizations, are behind the annual event. The goal is to help people experience the challenges non-drivers face in rural areas like Humboldt, where public transportation options are limited.
For 1 full week, Santa Cruz County and Metro are encouraging people to find other ways to get around. Throughout the week, council members from across the county and county supervisors will be riding the bus to get firsthand experience in hopes of remembering their own experiences when voting on infrastructure funding.
All right, that's the video. That's Week Without Driving. Let's see if I can get us to the next slide here. All right. So one of the outcomes of Week Without Driving, this is my last slide, and then I'll take a few general questions if folks have them. One of the outcomes of Week Without Driving has been a campaign, and this is the campaign that I'm focused on right now in Washington State, to really think about who represents transit riders in transit board governance. Some of the elected leaders who participated in Week Without Driving came to us and were sort of, frustrated that many of their other fellow transit board members never rode the bus, had zero experience riding transit, and didn't really want to engage, right, around what it meant to be a transit rider. And so they joined with us in supporting legislation that we passed this year in Washington that will allow transit agencies in our state to add 2 voting seats for transit riders, people who rely on transit in their communities, to the transit boards. This is a big deal for us because currently our state law dictates that the only folks who can sit on these transit boards are the elected leaders from various jurisdictions that the transit agency covers. And so we had to actually go to the state law to change that to be able for the agencies to be able to add these additional voting seats. So pretty exciting that this is happening. The map on the top is the transit agencies that are covered by this law in Washington State. So there's a lot sort of in our denser Puget Sound region, but also a lot in the more rural parts of our communities as well. This image on the bottom is actually a screenshot from an article from the Philippines where their transit agencies there, their Department of Transportation there actually just passed a requirement that people on the transit board have to ride the bus. That's part of their sort of job requirements for fulfilling that role, which I thought is another kind of cool way to go around it, to make sure that people who are, making those decisions about the services that really impact our lives understand what they're deciding about. So that's it. That's the end of my talk. I'm happy to take some questions. Again, Non-Drivers Alliance is the organization I'm working with now to support getting transit riders on transit boards. We will also be continuing to do a lot of the National Week Without Driving coordination. My email again is anna@nondrivers.org if you want to be in touch. And then there's a screenshot of my book, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. It was published by Island Press in 2024. I'm guessing it's probably available at the library. If not, you should request it. If you do want a copy, actually, Island Press, all the books at Island Press this week are 50% off, which is a big deal. So you can get it for 50% off. You can also get a whole bunch of other really wonderful transportation and urban planning books at Island Press. So if you're looking for books for you or for holiday gifts, highly recommend you check out Island Press and pick some up. So I will stop sharing my screen, see if there's any other comments or questions.
Got a few comments, but first, thank you so much, Anna, for your presentation. It was truly a treat to have you with us tonight. Thank you, thank you. And yes, if you all have not done so already, we do have Anna's book as part of the library's collection, so please go ahead and check that out. But I have a question for you, Anna. Being that we are in Silicon Valley, I feel like the idea of autonomous driving vehicles is always on the news. It's always a hot topic. So, and I know you touched on it earlier, but what would you say is the kind of the biggest risk for relying too much on, the privatized solutions of, non-drivers, as it were?
Yeah. And I'm going to pull up an article to share in the chat. So I've had the opportunity to ride Waymo a few times, not in the Bay Area, but in Phoenix, in which I know the Phoenix suburbs are a very different sort of built environment than, say, the city of San Francisco. But my experience there was that it was a pretty frictionless, experience for me. As someone who's low vision, it was kind of nice to have the car like color code thing. Like there was like it was easy for me to find the vehicle. Usually trying to find a ride hail vehicle is tricky for me. And I've gotten in non-ride hail vehicles before by accident, which is always humiliating and a little scary. But I think part of that frictionlessness is the problem, right? Because I mean, first of all, it's not frictionless for a lot of people. Like they're not making wheelchair accessible versions yet of these vehicles, and may never find the price incentive to do so. But also just that, the more our communities get built around driving and the more driving is sort of easy and convenient for people to do, the more that's going to happen, right? The more driving is going to be induced. If it's easy to get in the back of a car and not have to be the driver, then, driving further to do something will be less of a burden and you'll be more likely to make that trip and more likely to make that longer trip. And I think where that heads us, right, is towards greater car dependency, right? It heads us, to, having to go like my grandma did, into the next town over because there's no local grocery stores, right? Um, it heads us towards communities being further out, right? Affordable housing being built further out because there's not, the need for it to be close enough in for people to want to make that trip. And so I worry about a future where that is that's where we're headed. So and I will paste that link in the chat if you want to hear my more coherent written thoughts. But
Absolutely.
good to get that question.
Yeah. And then I have a couple minutes left. Outside of your book, which again, please people check out, what are some other resources that you would recommend people look into if they want to learn more, if they're interested in how to kind of contribute to this non-driver movement?
Yeah, I mean, the Week Without Driving is definitely a place to check out. There's a lot of resources on that website. If you just follow hashtag Week Without Driving on mostly Instagram these days, though I think there's been a lot of posts on Facebook and Twitter and Blue Sky and TikTok in the and past years as well. That's kind of an exciting place to go and join the conversation and see how people both who can't drive and people who are participating in that week or thinking about how they would participate in that week are engaging with what it means to be a non-driver. The last resource I'll recommend is NRDC's recent research on the percentage of Americans who don't have reliable access to a car. That just came out in October. It's really interesting research. You can go down to the sort of the level of a census tract and look at your community and the populations of non-drivers within it. And so again, that's a great resource. If you Google NRDC, households without access to a car, that will get you there.
Anna, thank you again so much for your talk. It was a pleasure to have you. The book is When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. Please take a look, check it out. And Anna, thank you one more time for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. My entourage has returned, so it's a good time to wrap this up.
Perfect, perfect.
Yeah.